We're parents, teachers, and educators, and like you, we're passionate about restoring our culture for Christ. This is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.
Hello again, I am Marlon Detweiler, and this is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. Today we have someone with us that I have known since high school and maybe younger years. For her, she didn't know me when I was Carolyn Wilson. Welcome.
Hello. Good to
Carolyn,
see you.
Carolyn, as you will learn, teaches for us, and there are a number of other connections that I alluded to relationally. Let me just mention, is the daughter of Tom Garfield, who works for Veritas Scholars Academy as the academic dean, and I've known for a long time. He has been noted well here before. And Carolyn now lives again in Moscow, Idaho, and that is a familiar place for many of you. My first trip there was for what now is known as the first ACCS conference, and I still remember going to the rental car counter in the airport in Spokane, Washington. Them telling us you have a full tank of gas to get there. It's a 90-mile drive, I think.
Yeah.
And make sure you have a full tank of gas on the way home because there's no place to get gas between here and there. Now, I know that's changed. You get gas between the two places now, but back then you couldn't. I never heard of such a place. Tell us about your personal circumstances before we get into the topics at hand.
Sure. I was thinking about that. I remember meeting you because back in the day, they used all of us high school kids, run around and do errands. We didn't have cell phones really to communicate things. So we were the runners, go print the thing, it was, we actually had faxes and all that. It was old, but I've grown up, as you mentioned, in classical education all my life, and God has just seen fit to make that my life. I love it passionately. That's what I went to college for, and jumped right into teaching fresh out of my senior year at a classical Christian school. I taught at another one.
Tell us what school that was.
Oh, sure. Okay. It was Providence Classical Christian School. I was very young at the time, as many of them were. And I was in what I would perhaps describe as like the first wave of graduates who had gone K-12 through the classical Christian program and then into teaching. So naturally, the first question any of us would be asked is, can you teach Latin?
The school is in the Seattle.
It's in Seattle. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And now there's a couple others, I think. Yeah. And then I taught
Providence, like Veritas, I think between the two of them, there may be 50 or 60 schools that use those terms.
It's true. Yeah. I taught at the Oaks in Spokane for 5 years after that, and then moved to England because I got married and had all my children there. And Mark and I have 3 kids, which is delightful. And then God saw fit to bring us back to the United States in 2016. As you mentioned, and my husband teaches at Logos School, the physical version, and our kids go there, and I teach here, which is fabulous.
That's wonderful. You've been teaching for us for several years.
Yeah.
What have you been teaching? Carolyn has frozen.
This year, Dr. Cannon finally folded to my
Carolyn,
pressure.
You froze
Sorry.
on the recording, so you get to roll back about 15 seconds.
Okay, no worries. So I have been teaching here at Veritas for about 4 years now. And I started with Rhetoric 1, and then Dr. Cannon has finally folded to pressure from me and allowed me a U.S. history class this year as well.
It's coming.
So that's been delightful.
Or this current year?
Sorry?
Current
so
year
this year, I had it this year.
You just finished it. Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. What are you teaching next year?
The exact same thing. So I'll have a couple sections of Rhetoric 1 and the U.S. history course.
And how old are your children right now?
So Colin is my oldest at 11. Chloe will be 10 shortly, and Jack is 8.
Okay. And just for the record, this is being recorded in May of 2023, because one of the things I've realized about age of children is it keeps changing.
Weird.
Yeah, funny how that works. There is something that I have learned about you and the information that came to me, though, that you enjoy baking challenges. What does that mean?
You know my secrets. Yes, I do. I very much enjoy that. And my kids, my students know how to send me off on talking about that.
What do you enjoy baking?
Well, it's funny, just I've worked a lot with Becca Merkel actually with catering for new St. Andrews functions on the big scale. And it's been a good learning experience because she's brilliant with things. But I also then have merged into wedding catering and making the cake. So the wedding cakes are the challenge.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah.
a big deal. So you're back in your hometown where you grew up in Moscow, Idaho. Your husband teaches at Logos School, the school that was the subject school of the book Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, which for me and for many of us was the book that got us excited and interested and excited about classical ed. You went to New St. Andrews. That's from where you graduated, and then on to teaching immediately. What did you find as a classically educated kid to be the challenges and benefits of stepping right into teaching your first year out of college? And before you answer that, let me preface that with a reason for the question. At Veritas Scholars Academy, our online school at which you teach, we don't like hiring kids right out of college for lack of experience. We have the luxury of a world-class teacher group because we can go anywhere in the world to hire them. And so we've always worked on the basis of not wanting to hire rookies. Mm-hmm. But tell me what benefit you think it was for you having come up in a classical world, being classically educated yourself, that might say, yeah, but Marlon, you could do it this way with these people because of this, or what you found to be that really the strengths and weaknesses compared to people who might have come up in a state educational institution or a state school that had an education department, or even a traditional Christian school and a traditional Christian education prior to that. What did you find the benefits to be?
Yeah, no, that's a very good thing to ponder. Yeah, I would start by saying it is no guarantee that merely because one can get all the grades in classical education, therefore one can teach. And I have seen many cases where that has not been good. Somebody can have all the brains in the world and they still may not be the best teacher. And so it's good to remember that it doesn't automatically make you one. You know what I mean? But in the first years, yeah, there were so few of us and everybody was in that raging, we're starting schools all over the place. Right. And we need teachers. So I think I was also in that phase of classical education where we're maybe just going to grab you no matter what.
Schools didn't have the luxury of being patient and looking for experience. We had a situation, and this is parenthetical, we had a situation at Veritas Academy, the bricks and mortar school that we used to be associated with, where our children went, right. That we brought someone in from New St. Andrews.
Sure.
They were getting a degree and wanted to be a teacher and had never had any experience in the classroom, even teaching a single class. And it was honestly a disaster and it just didn't work. We didn't hire them.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, and see, that can happen. I actually have some pretty potent feelings on it. I would love to see more student teacher training, I think. And I did benefit briefly from that. But, you know, it's a complicated thing to do that. You understand, you know, you're handing over a class, right? But I think there should be a way at some point, somebody should do that. But in those early years, I did benefit, at least certainly from coming from Logos. I had been well grounded in the understanding that I am teaching this stuff, certainly, but that the bigger thing was I knew how to teach, not just give them stuff, but know the person, know the class, understand my audience, You can see where I'm going here with rhetoric,
But
right?
where did you learn that, though, if you didn't have a teaching practicum
Sure.
or experience in teaching?
Because in one sense I did, because I was learning my own teachers. And I was given that gift of imitation of my own very good teachers. So I had people like Chris Schlecht and Doug Wilson and Nancy and my own dad for history, and people who just gave me their passion and love for their subject. That's what I wanted.
Well, I want to push back on that a little bit because
Sure.
my experience tells me that that's about your unique learning style. One of the things, and I forget which category this falls in of the four main learning style categories, but one of the things that you just articulated is something that I think is important to my learning process, and that's learning by observation.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't learn by observation in the same way.
Sure.
And do you think that benefited you for lack of experience?
I do actually.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that may have played heavy because a tactile learner would probably not have made the same connections that you made to apply in your first year of teaching.
Granted. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. What else do you think made a difference? Clearly, content did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I did teach Latin a lot in those early years. It wasn't my favorite, but I could do it. So I did, and I had experience, of course, having done what the students were doing. So I was familiar with literature and rhetoric and history that they were having. And I just appreciate, though, again, Dorothy Sayers says, as you well know, at the end of that essay, we're talking about that the point of learning is to teach a man to learn for himself. And I was given that tool. I knew how to learn for myself. And I think of course I made first year teacher mistakes. Goodness, sorry, headmasters. But I had people, though, who came alongside me, and this is the benefit on the side note of Christian education. If I screwed up or messed up, people who addressed that and in varying degrees of strength as it was needed, and helped me to grow. So I felt like I was well equipped in that way to understand how to listen and to learn.
Yeah, that's great. What you taught Latin and you taught U.S. history. Did you teach rhetoric at that point?
Oh, yes.
First year you taught rhetoric?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Tell me about the things that went well and the things that you wish you had a chance to push the redo button.
Sure. Broadly, or in my teaching of rhetoric, what do you think?
I'm speaking of rhetoric in particular, because that's a focus of what you teach for us.
Yeah.
The capstone discipline in many respects.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a tough place to step in first year teaching.
Yeah. It was our first year. It was, how these things go. The top class was the juniors, so it had never been done before. We were all pioneering together. And that was good because here I am, young teacher with a young school, so we could grow together and write curriculum. Yeah. I would have liked to have had a better prepared way of going into rhetoric with these guys. This first class I'm thinking of. It was helpful to have my classical sources. Aristotle was my best friend right there, because we're going direct from the text. We didn't have anything. But I had been at least taught it. And I've been
from hundreds and hundreds, millennia ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here he is. But the benefit for me is I'd been taught it well, both in high school and college, and I had the benefit. I'll shout out to Dr. Chris Schlecht, who is just a brilliant teacher, and I had him, and it was wonderful. So that was helpful, and I had my notes from college and things that I was using for the kids. So I think, though, the broader thing was not necessarily the stuff. Again, it wasn't the content. I knew that. I would have appreciated perhaps more humility from myself back then. You know how it is. I graduated. I know all things.
I fight, we all fight being self-centered, but there is nothing like age to help you realize the older you get, the less you know.
So true. That would be, I do wish I had, been more patient, not as quick to maybe put my own, it's really easy for a young teacher to want to have the students think their opinions after them. And instead of making it a better environment for the students to express their own opinions, even if they disagree, that's important. And I wish I'd known that then.
Yeah, there's wisdom, and that wisdom comes most times from some experience. Sounds like you learned that. Sounds like you learned it pretty quickly.
Well, God used some experiences to go, hey.
Well, this is not a public confessional, so we can move on. That's great. What would you say the things were that the student, if we were to talk to that class of students
Sure.
today, what would they say they got from that rhetoric class that you taught your first year?
Yeah, that's a great question, Marlon. I would at least hope that they got my passion for it. I loved what I did. I'm a reasonably, as you know, expressive person.
I have never seen you, shall we say, quiet.
No. You know my dad, so
Yeah.
I blame him.
You can, and I relate to that very well.
Yeah, I did, but I am pretty open, and yeah, I love what I do, and I love teaching rhetoric, and even that first year where I'm inexperienced in that extent, I was excited to talk about this with my students, to give them the chance to come up and talk and give their thoughts on things. And so I would hope that they go, yes, she loved her subject, even if she wasn't as good at it at the moment. We knew that, which helps a student's interest in the subject, you know.
That's wonderful. We've made an assumption here that I want to step back behind now and maybe articulate the assumption, or in terms of why we made the assumption, or why it's important. We've assumed a very basic thing, that rhetoric is an important thing to teach in high school. Anyone that studied the pedagogy of classical Christian education has come across the term the trivium, and they understand the rhetoric stage, and the rhetoric, the subject or the discipline of rhetoric being maybe the paradigm discipline of that stage, certainly an important one. But the question I want to ask you is, why is rhetoric important in a K-12 classical education?
Absolutely. And since we have limited time, you're lucky, and I don't get to deliver a thesis to you.
Oh boy.
No,
I am.
no, Marlon, you ask a good, this is the sort of subject that when people who are outside of the classical world ask you, say, you have 2 minutes in the grocery store to explain to somebody who has no idea what classical is, when I
Your father actually does it this way. We're on a 10-story elevator ride. Tell me now. But he does it about classical education, not just rhetoric.
Yeah, that's big. That is his gift. He can do that one. Yeah, but it's an older term. It's a different sort of class, and so people, rhetoric, what is this? And if you have a few seconds, you can say, well, it's similar to a speech class, which I suppose is the best comparison we can give to more secular or just outside of classical education. Speech and debate is often what people will associate that with. And what I learned how to narrow it down to as well is just sticking to my friends, the classicists like Quintilian and Cicero, and just saying, well, it's the art of speaking well, or it's the art of observing the means to persuade. And why is it important for our students to do this? Because that's what we were created to do. We were made to persuade, go out and preach the gospel to all nations. So we better equip them to do so. And it's a safe environment for them to learn how to defend and express their own opinions with a humble boldness to do just that. So if I have time to get that into people, they kind of give me a look sometimes if they don't really know, but I'm like, that's what it is. So good luck, everyone.
You limited it to speaking, but wouldn't it be, in the most comprehensive sense, all forms of communication?
I mean, in the sense of, we, especially, here we are with a visual, right? Visual is huge, and we know that how a person appears to us is important. How they sound, how they live, that's important. And so I do think there is an aspect to that for sure. I think the rhetoric of the classical age understood that the three elements, ethos, pathos, and logos, all have to work together to create the well-rounded rhetor. Yes.
Yeah. As I think about rhetoric, I like to think about it comprehensively. I've recently read a book. I was trying to think of the author's name or the name of the book, but it's a very old and very important book. I say very old, not like Aristotle. I'm talking about
Sure.
1960s on facial expression and how we can tell what somebody's feeling,
Sure.
how they look. And
Right.
it was amazing to me to apply that in
Mhm.
conversational setting and think about it as I speak and communicate. Of course, writing is a form of communication also, and body language and that sort of thing. And all of those do have the element of communicating. Is the reason I think about it more than speaking sometimes.
Right.
I don't think anybody's arguing over that in a serious way. Most of the conversation that we're talking about is about the conversation, about what we say. And I think that's really good. What is the difference that you hope a student that's had rhetoric will go away with for the rest of their lives over somebody who has not?
Yeah, very much. I feel like rhetoric is the discipline of taking Sayers calls it grist for the mill. So all your other subjects and using that. Yeah. Yeah. And being able to interact with anything that you're presented with in a gracious and persuasive manner. As a Christian, I do believe that rhetoric, and it's overlapping with apologetics. I tend to plug apologetics a lot in my class. But being able to go, oh yeah, we talked about this thing in history. Oh yeah, we talked about this thing in omnibus. Oh yeah, we talked about this thing in chemistry. And here's how I could persuade this person about this element of my opinion on any given topic, that we've handed them that tool. And I can't stress enough how valuable that is to a high school student, particularly heading to college where they're going to be challenged on so many of those things. How can they then respond?
Yeah, very good. So in the time frame that you've been teaching rhetoric for us at Veritas, you have taken on a new textbook, a textbook that we published, A Rhetoric of Love.
Right.
Tell us how that changed how we teach rhetoric, and tell us what you think about the approach to rhetoric that has introduced.
Sure. Yeah. So Mr. Jones, who was actually one of my teachers at college, so
the author of A Rhetoric of Love.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I know. So it was fun to kind of go through it because he's big into philosophy, as you know, and an expert in his field in that. And so it'd be fun to see. I'll come across little things. I'm like, I remember talking about this with you. So
I didn't even think when I asked the question, I didn't think about those kinds of insights that you would have had. I knew you had him, and I knew that, but I didn't make the connection. Wonderful.
Isn't that fun? And it does. It really adds an element for me to teach, and I can tell the kids that as well. I know this guy, so here's an angle that he's probably pushing with you in this book, and that adds a nice personal element for
my students. Might scare Doug if he knew that.
That would be funny. That's a funny thought. So I've enjoyed his perspective on this, and he likes to spice things up for sure. He'll kind of present certain aspects and concepts in a new way, a more modern way in some cases, or just a different angle in other cases. He likes to emphasize the story of a thing. That's very much, Doug has always been like that. He loves story. I remember this, he's written some other books as well, fiction and things. And so he'll put that out there. And early in his textbook, which I appreciate, he says, hey, you're going to come across opinions and different things that will challenge you, including in this book. And you should deal with that. You should push back. And so that's great, because of course we have students from all kinds of backgrounds and beliefs and different things in this book have challenged them, and they have argued with him but that's right. But that's actually, it's produced some of the best conversations I've ever had in my rhetoric classes, because these guys are really passionate about wanting, but why would he think this? Or maybe what about this or this? And I think this, and I love it. I just sit back mostly and go, yeah, go ahead. Tell me your thoughts.
That's wonderful. Yeah. When we think about taking on publishing curriculum at Veritas, which we've done a lot of, we have three things that we have to have in place before we'll go forward with creating something. First of all, we have to have the money available that's going to take the curriculum, which is a pretty obvious one. Second, we have to have the person, well, let me say it in a different order. Second, we have to have the idea of the curriculum. We never want to create something where we can't say, we've looked at the marketplace and we think this is an idea that raises the bar to a level that's better and higher than anything that exists. So we want what we call a better mousetrap to produce. And then thirdly, we need to have the talent, in this case, Doug Jones, create it. And to me, it was such a hard thing. I had been involved in classical education publishing, 1996. So roughly at that point, for more than 20 years, and had been able to come up with that better mousetrap idea for a lot of different things. What we've done with the great books with Omnibus, what we do with History of Bible Grammar School, composition. I could keep going. A number of different things. Rhetoric was that thing that stumped me. And when I talked to Doug and he talked about how we would bring Aristotle's rhetoric into the Christian realm in the 20th, now 21st, well, actually the 21st century, it resonated like few things did. And I was thrilled. And I'm glad you're enjoying teaching it.
Very much. Yeah.
How does it differ from the rhetoric that you learned in an academic setting in Logos or New St. Andrews?
Well, yeah, quite simply, we were dealing directly with the classical text. We didn't have a textbook for rhetoric. I'm sure things existed. You probably did some homework on this, I would imagine. And I'm sure there were companion volumes, right? Yeah. So, but we didn't have that kind of stuff, and they usually weren't appropriate for high school anyway. They were pretty dry, dusty kind of commentary sort of things. So it was direct from Aristotle to us, or Cicero to us, or Quintilian to us. So I've read all of it. In terms of those gentlemen, I don't know. I am not the definitive expert on all rhetoric, but it was, and then gone through the teacher, and so it was very much dependent on the teacher themselves being with the material and being able to explain it in a way that students would understand.
Can you articulate a couple specifics that would provide a qualitative difference between an Aristotle and a Cicero who are not thinking Christianly and a Christian approach to rhetoric that a rhetoric of love is trying to be? Sure.
I think, approaching Cicero and Aristotle, just the actual textbook, as I got to do, their work straight up, it was very much making sure that, okay, have we given our students a good foundation biblically to think about these guys? And they did a good job, and I had great teachers for that. This book, of course, has it side by side of here. These guys have to say, here is this approach, here's a way we can talk about it, right? Bring it into the modern application, perhaps.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
So what you're saying is it was dependent on the teachers, Christian worldview thinking into a secular approach.
Right.
And we have to understand that secular approaches many times borrow from the Christian worldview, and
always,
Aristotle and Cicero. There's a good bit of that there. So the jump is not as big a chasm as it can be sometimes.
Sure.
Very good.
Totally.
Carolyn, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us here. If you were to run into a parent at the grocery store and they said to you, why should my kid take rhetoric? This is your last chance in this podcast to answer that question.
All right, you bet. I've got one. It's applicable to apologetics as well, very much, which is how I learned it. But 1 Timothy says, always be prepared to give an answer for the truth that is in you. And if you cannot do that eloquently, if you're stumbling around, then is that the best light we can be for Christ in the world?
Wow.
So rhetoric is the way to be an eloquent Christian and make that difference.
Wow. Thank you so much. Folks, we've had Carolyn Wilson, teacher at Veritas Scholars Academy, mother of 3, wife and daughter, and a wonderful friend. Carolyn, thank you so much. Folks, thank you for joining us at Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.